He ordered his own army to destroy its own cannons, and it was the smartest decision in military history. Imagine being a soldier watching your commander burn the very weapons that were supposed to save you. No boots. No pay. No food. That was the French army in 1796, a ragged, starving mob that Europe's greatest empire refused to take seriously. What if I told you that everything you believed about the rules of warfare collapsed on one hot summer day? At the end of the 18th century, the art of war was slow, like a game of chess, where armies crept across the field and generals valued position over speed. The world believed that to win, you needed time, supplies, and heavy artillery. Then a 26-year-old Corsican, sickly, pale, and mocked by his own officers, decided to burn every rule of warfare to the ground. He turned an exhausted, starving army into a blade that could cut through the most powerful military machine in Europe. And at the exact moment when caution should have saved him, he chose madness. Watch this video to the end, and you'll learn how one impossible decision, abandoning his own cannons in the dead of night, gave birth to modern warfare, and why generals still study this battle 2 centuries later.
In the spring of 1796, the French army in Italy was a sight that inspired pity rather than fear. The soldiers sent by the government to conquer the richest lands in Europe resembled vagabonds dressed in rags. Many had no boots and wrapped their feet in cloth, leaving bloody footprints on the rocky alpine trails. Discipline was maintained by the young commander's word and promises of glory and wealth. Supplies were virtually non-existent, and cavalry horses collapsed from exhaustion on the march without even rotten hay to eat. Officers had not been paid for months and looked at their new general with poorly concealed skepticism and distrust. Napoleon Bonaparte was only 26 years old and looked sickly thin and pale. Old soldiers who had fought in many campaigns considered him a political upstart who had obtained his position through his bed or connections. But in the eyes of this small man burned a strange, frightening fire that silenced even the most daring loudmouths. Opposing them was the Austrian military machine, one of the most powerful and organized forces of the time. Austrian soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, dressed in immaculate white uniforms, and trained to act as a single mechanism. Their commanders were experienced strategists who had studied military science from the best textbooks of Frederick the Great. They despised the French mob of ragamuffins, considering them a bunch of revolutionary anarchists incapable of serious resistance. Vienna sent its best regiments to Italy to put an end to the French threat on its southern borders once and for all. This armada was commanded by Field Marshal Dagbert von Wurmser, a veteran with grey hair and decorated with medals. He led tens of thousands of bayonets, huge supply trains, and powerful artillery. Wurmser was confident that he would simply crush the French with his superior numbers, driving them back into the mountains. Napoleon understood that in a direct head-on collision, his army did not stand a chance. He had to come up with something completely different, something that did not fit into the logic of the old school. He bet on the only thing he had in abundance, the lightness and mobility of his soldiers. He decided to turn the absence of heavy baggage trains and tents, which was considered a weakness, into a major advantage. The French learned to cover distances in a day that the Austrians took 3 or 4 days to cover. They slept on the ground, ate whatever they could find or take, and were always ready for battle. This incredible mobility allowed Napoleon to appear where his enemies least expected him. He began to wage war not for territory but for time, gaining precious hours. However, even the fastest army cannot run forever if it is cornered by strategic circumstances. By midsummer, the situation had become critical. The Austrians launched a massive offensive, tightening the ring around the French forces. Wurmser divided his huge army into several columns to encircle the French from different sides. It was a classic tactic that was guaranteed to lead to the encirclement and destruction of the enemy. Napoleon found himself facing advancing columns, each of which was comparable to his own forces. Any miscalculation, any delay threatened complete disaster and the end of the campaign. He had to choose where to strike in order to destroy the Austrian field marshal's perfect plan. And it was at this moment that his genius manifested itself. His ability to see the entire battlefield as if on a map. The young general realized that the division of the enemy's forces was not only a threat, but also a unique opportunity. If he could move quickly enough, he would be able to defeat the Austrian columns one by one, preventing them from joining forces. But to implement this plan, we had to do the impossible and abandon all the usual rules of safety. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. At the center of the entire military campaign in northern Italy was the fortress of Mantua, a giant stone castle surrounded by water and swamps. It was the key to all of Lombardy, and whoever controlled Mantua controlled the roads and crossings. The French army had been conducting an exhausting siege of this citadel for several weeks, trying to break the resistance of the Austrian garrison. The siege required enormous resources, thousands of soldiers, and most importantly, heavy artillery. With great difficulty, the French dragged their best siege guns, taken from ships and other forts, to the walls of the fortress. These cannons were the pride of the army, the only means capable of breaching the thick walls of Mantua. Soldiers dug trenches under the scorching Italian sun, suffering from malaria caused by the rotten swamp waters. The garrison of the fortress resisted desperately, knowing that help was close, and they only needed to hold out a little longer. Wurmser was heading here, his main goal being to unblock Mantua and join forces with the besieged. If this happened, the combined Austrian forces would outnumber the French several times over. Napoleon found himself tied to the walls of the fortress like a chained dog to its kennel. He could not simply abandon the siege, because then the garrison would strike him in the rear at the most crucial moment. But he could not stay where he was either, as Wurmser's army was advancing inexorably from the north. Scouts reported that Austrian columns were descending from the Alps and already capturing the advanced French posts. Time was working against Bonaparte, and every hour brought the denouement closer. Wurmser, acting according to classical canons, divided his forces, sending General Kvajanovich along the western shore of Lake Garda. The field marshal himself moved along the eastern shore with the main forces, planning to take the French in a pincer movement. This plan seemed flawless on paper and in the staff offices in Vienna. The Austrians were confident that Napoleon would cling to the siege to the last, trying to protect his precious cannons. The situation in the French camp was close to panic when the soldiers learned of the approach of a huge enemy army. The officers argued hoarsely, suggesting either retreating across the Po River or taking up a defensive position. No one believed it was possible to continue the siege and fight the advancing army at the same time. Napoleon remained silent, bent over his maps, measuring distances with a compass and calculating marching speeds. Mantua had become bait, a trap that could snap shut at any moment and break the backbone of the French army. The walls of the fortress, which were supposed to be a trophy, had now become a burden, hindering maneuverability. In military history, there were rare situations when a commander voluntarily gave up an almost achieved goal for a ghostly chance of salvation. But Napoleon understood that thinking in terms of fortresses meant losing the war. He saw that salvation lay not in holding positions, but in movement, in the space between the Austrian columns. To win, he needed to become free again, to throw off the heavy shackles of siege warfare. This required a decision that would seem insane or treasonous to most of his contemporaries. But it is precisely such decisions that separate merely good generals from great historical figures. The tension grew with each passing hour as messengers brought increasingly alarming news of the enemy's advance. Soldiers cleaned their muskets and wrote farewell letters home, realizing that the coming battle could be their last. Everyone was waiting for the order, but no one could predict what it would be. Are you ready to find out what incredible step Napoleon took to escape this trap? Napoleon made a decision that made his staff officers' hair stand on end and took their breath away. He ordered the immediate lifting of the siege of Mantua and the abandonment of all heavy siege weapons that could not be quickly removed. These included dozens of cannons and tons of gunpowder and ammunition, which had been brought there at the cost of incredible effort and human lives. The generals begged him to reconsider, arguing that it was a disgrace and a loss of strategic advantage. They said that without artillery, it would be impossible to take the fortress in the future, even if they defeated Wurmser. But Bonaparte was adamant. We will take them back when we win in the field, or we will capture the Austrian ones. For him, iron was worthless if it meant losing the mobility of his army. On the night before their departure, French engineers began the grim task of destroying their own artillery. They riveted the cannons, broke the carriages, threw the guns into swamps and lakes, and burned the ammunition wagons. The glow of the fires lit up the walls of Mantua, and the Austrian garrison watched this strange self-destruction with amazement. It seemed to them that the French had gone mad, or were fleeing in panic without looking back. They poured gunpowder into the water so that it would not fall into enemy hands, and chopped the wheels of the gun carriages into pieces with axes. The soldiers who just yesterday had guarded these cannons like the apple of their eye were now destroying them with tears in their eyes. It was a psychologically difficult moment, a test of absolute trust in the commander. Napoleon sacrificed his main striking force in order to gain freedom of maneuver. By abandoning the siege, the French army instantly transformed from a sluggish bear into a pack of swift wolves. Now nothing held them in one place, and they could move in any direction at maximum speed. Napoleon concentrated all his forces into a fist, ready to strike one of the Austrian columns. His target was General Kvarzanovic, who carelessly rushed forward, unaware that the siege had been lifted. This move came as a complete surprise to the Austrian command, which was still operating in the rhythm of the old war. Wurmser was sure that Napoleon would defend his positions near Mantua to the last soldier. He couldn't imagine that the general would willingly give up to the enemy what he had conquered over months. This mistake in assessing the enemy's psychology proved fatal for the entire Austrian campaign. The lifting of the siege allowed Napoleon to transfer his forces to the north and meet Kvardzanovic's column in full force. The French, embittered by the loss of their cannons and thirsty for revenge, made an incredible forced march. They covered 50 kilometers a day, appearing where they were expected only a week later. Speed became their new artillery, their main caliber in this war. Kvarzanovic, finding not weak barriers but the entire French army in front of him, was stunned. His column, stretched out along mountain roads, was vulnerable and unprepared for a large-scale battle. He tried to regroup, but it was too late. French divisions were closing in on him. Napoleon brilliantly implemented the principle of concentrating forces against part of the enemy's forces. This decision went down in history as one of the most striking examples of strategic courage and calculation. It showed that material losses are nothing compared to the gains in tempo and initiative. Napoleon proved that sometimes you have to take a step back and burn your bridges in order to take 2 steps forward. Did you like the young Bonaparte's bold strategy? Like this post if you think the risk was justified. Events began to unfold at a dizzying pace, which contemporaries would later call Napoleonic. The first victim of the new strategy was the Battle of Lonato, which took place in early August. Napoleon, taking advantage of his central position, attacked the scattered parts of Kvardzanovic's corps. The Battle of Lonato was chaotic, full of skirmishes, ambushes, and surprise attacks in thick fog. The French divisions, controlled by a single will, acted like a well-coordinated mechanism, cutting through the Austrian ranks. At one point, Napoleon himself was nearly captured, finding himself with a small escort in front of an entire Austrian battalion. But his coolness and bluffing forced the enemy to lay down their arms, believing they were surrounded. Kvarzdanovic's defeat was complete. The Austrians lost thousands of men as prisoners and were forced to retreat in disorder back to the Alps. One of the claws that was supposed to crush the French army had been cut off. Now Napoleon could turn around 180 degrees and face Wurmser's main forces. He no longer had a threat behind him and was in complete control of the situation. At this time, Wurmser, unaware of his colleague's disaster, solemnly entered Mantua. He saw the abandoned French gun carriages and destroyed trenches and decided that he had won a great victory without a fight. The garrison welcomed him as a savior, bells rang in the city, and prayers were said. The old field marshal was convinced that the French were fleeing in panic and that all he had to do was pursue them. Having lost precious time celebrating and regrouping, Wurmser finally set off in pursuit of the retreating Bonaparte. He left the safety of the fortress walls and headed for the town of Castiglione, where he thought he would finish off the enemy's rear guard. He did not know that he was walking straight into a trap set by a man who had already outplayed him strategically. Wurmser led his army to slaughter, blinded by the illusion of his own superiority. Napoleon did not choose the battlefield at Castiglione by chance. The terrain allowed him to hide his reserves and maneuver. The hills and plains created ideal conditions for the dynamic battle he had planned. He knew that the Austrians would attack confidently and recklessly, and he intended to use that confidence against them. His soldiers, inspired by their victory at Lonato, were ready for a new fight. The French army took up positions, but Napoleon was in no hurry to reveal his full strength. He left part of his forces in the rear, creating the appearance that his line of defense was thin and unreliable. This was an invitation for Wurmser to attack, to draw all his reserves into battle. Napoleon was preparing a classic but masterfully executed tactical maneuver. Bonaparte's headquarters was a hive of feverish activity. Aides galloped about with orders. Generals finalized the last details of the plan. Each division commander knew his maneuver, his time, and his place in the coming spectacle. This was no longer a band of ragged rebels, but an instrument of war, honed by the genius of its leader. They waited for the white uniforms to appear on the horizon. Wurmser deployed his troops, anticipating an easy victory over the Republican rabble. He saw before him an enemy that seemed barely able to stand. Austrian drums beat the attack, and the orderly lines of infantry moved forward. The old school of warfare was preparing to teach the new one a lesson, unaware that the lesson would be a cruel one for itself. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise to the roar of cannons. Napoleon carefully studied every ravine and every grove, turning geography into his ally. He understood that Wurmser, confident in his numerical superiority, would try to envelop the French flanks. It was precisely on this desire of the enemy to surround him that Bonaparte's daring plan was based. Napoleon's plan was both simple and ingenious, to force Wurmser to stretch his lines as wide as possible. To do this, the French center had to play the role of a weak victim, ready to collapse under the onslaught. This would provoke the Austrians to throw their last reserves into battle, to break through the defenses and decide the outcome of the battle. But as soon as the enemy became bogged down in battle, a crushing blow would be dealt. The main role in this plan was assigned to General Serurier's division, which was approaching the battlefield on the march. Wurmser was unaware of the existence of this division, believing that all French forces were already before him. Serurier was to outflank the Austrian left flank at the height of the battle. This was the very hammer that was to strike the anvil. On the morning of August 5th, 1796, the sun shone on the ranks of two armies ready for a decisive battle. The Austrians lined up in perfect lines, their bayonets gleaming and their banners flying proudly in the wind. The French looked less impressive, but their eyes showed the determination of men who had nowhere to retreat. The air trembled with tension, and even the birds fell silent, sensing the rumble of cannon fire. Napoleon rode around his troops, encouraging the soldiers with short, energetic phrases. He knew many of the veterans by sight and joked with them, reminding them of past victories. The soldiers responded with enthusiastic cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" Although the Empire was still far away, they already saw him as their emperor. This mystical connection between the commander and the army was incomprehensible to the Austrian aristocratic generals. Wurmser began the battle with an artillery duel, hoping to suppress the French batteries with his firepower superiority. The ground rose in fountains of dust and stones, and cannonballs pierced gaps in the living walls of infantry. But the French stood to the death, closing the gaps and responding with accurate fire from their few cannons. Discipline under fire was ironclad, despite the army's appearance. Seeing the steadfastness of the center, the Austrian commander began to advance his wings, trying to outflank the French. He acted predictably, just as Napoleon had expected, as if reading a script written by the enemy. The Austrian lines stretched out, becoming thinner in the center to reinforce the flank attacks. Wurmser himself weakened his army, thinking he was strengthening the offensive. At that moment, the French generals' nerves were stretched tight. They needed to hold their positions, but not counterattack prematurely. Masséna and Auger, the division commanders, struggled to restrain their soldiers, who were eager to rush into battle. Napoleon, clock in hand, watched the events unfold, waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that a premature attack would ruin everything, and a delayed one could be fatal. Dust rose in columns to the sky, obscuring the maneuvers of the troops and creating chaos in which only Bonaparte could find his bearings. He conducted this orchestra of death like a conductor, where each instrument had to come in at the right moment. Wurmser was falling deeper and deeper into the trap that had been set for him. All eyes in the French headquarters were fixed on the direction from which Serurier's division was supposed to appear. Not only the fate of the battle, but also that of the whole of Italy depended on its timely arrival. Napoleon was playing for high stakes, risking his career and the lives of thousands of people. In the heat of battle, Napoleon gave an order that might have seemed like treason, to begin a retreat in the center. The French battalions, which had been holding their ground, began to slowly retreat, firing randomly. From the outside, it looked like panic had set in, as if the Republicans' fighting spirit had finally been broken. The Austrian officers, seeing the backs of their enemies, were overcome with indescribable excitement and anticipation of triumph. Wurmser, observing the battlefield through his spyglass, decided that the moment of truth had come and victory was his. He ordered all remaining reserves to attack in order to turn the French retreat into a rout. The Austrian infantry broke ranks and rushed forward, driven by a thirst for glory and easy prey. This flight was a masterfully executed theatrical performance, rehearsed right under fire. The French veterans retreated in an organized manner, maintaining their formation and readiness to turn around at any moment. They drew the Austrians deeper and deeper into the bag, forcing their lines to stretch out and lose contact with each other. The euphoria of the chase deprived the Austrian command of caution. The Austrian right wing advanced so far forward that it was practically cut off from the main forces. Wurmser was so carried away by the attack that he did not notice how his army had lost its compactness and control. He saw only the retreating French and did not look around, where clouds were already gathering. The greed for victory clouded the mind of the experienced field marshal. Napoleon, standing on high ground, coldly watched as the enemy exposed itself to attack. He saw how the Austrian battalions were mixing together, how their order was being disrupted in pursuit of the retreating enemy. It was a moment when order turned into chaos and strength became weakness. The clock struck noon, and the sun was at its zenith, illuminating this grandiose mistake. Suddenly, the fleeing French regiments stopped dead in their tracks. At the command of drums and trumpets, they turned to face their pursuers and bristled with a wall of bayonets. A deadly volley at point-blank range mowed down the first ranks of the Austrian infantry, halting their victorious advance. At that moment, the smiles on the faces of the Austrian officers turned to grimaces of horror. At the same time, Napoleon gave the signal to the artillery, which had been silent until then, hidden in ambush. The French cannons, assembled into a large battery, opened a hail of fire on the crowded masses of the enemy. The grape shot mowed down entire swathes of white uniforms, sowing panic and confusion. The trap snapped shut, and the hunter instantly became the prey. The psychological effect of this sudden transition from flight to attack was devastating. The Austrians, confident of victory, could not understand what was happening and lost the will to resist. Their commanders tried in vain to restore order, but their orders were drowned out by the roar of cannon fire and the cries of the wounded. The initiative passed entirely into Bonaparte's hands. Wurmser realized he had been deceived, but it was too late to change anything. His army was stretched thin, his reserves exhausted, and his center dangerously weakened. He could only watch as his magnificent regiments were ground down in the meat grinder set up by the young Corsican. It was a lesson for which Austria paid with thousands of lives. In the next chapter, you will learn where the final blow that destroyed the Empire's last hopes came from. Are you ready to find out how the hammer works when the anvil is already red hot? From the clouds of dust on the road leading to the Austrian rear, General Seruria's division appeared. Commanded that day by General Fiorella due to Seruria's illness. Their appearance was like a bolt from the blue for the Austrian headquarters. No one expected an attack from this direction, which was considered deep and safe rear. The division marched at a forced pace, the soldiers suffocating from the dust and heat, but they did not slow down. They knew that the outcome of the entire battle depended on their speed, and they marched to the sound of cannon fire. When they turned into battle formation and struck the flank and rear of the Austrians, the effect was like a bomb explosion. The Austrian line of defense cracked at the seams, unable to withstand the double pressure. Fiore acted decisively and ruthlessly, cutting off the Austrians' retreat to the crossings. His soldiers captured supply trains, artillery parks, and headquarters wagons, creating unimaginable chaos. Panic broke out in Wurmser's rear. Soldiers shouted that they were surrounded and threw down their weapons. Organized resistance began to disintegrate into isolated pockets of desperation. Wurmser was forced to deploy part of his forces to repel the threat from the rear, which further weakened his front. His army found itself caught between two fires, like a nut in a vice. The maneuver, conceived by Napoleon a few days earlier, was executed with mathematical precision. It was a classic demonstration of the superiority of maneuver over brute force. Napoleon, seeing the smoke from Fiorella's division's shots, realized that the decisive moment had come. He ordered his generals Massena and Augereau to launch a general offensive across the entire front. The French army, like a spring, straightened up and struck with all its might. The soldiers, sensing victory was near, attacked with frenzied fury. The Austrian soldiers, attacked from the front, flank, and rear, lost all hope. Their orderly squares broke up, turning into crowds of fleeing people. The officers tried to stop the flight with the flat of their sabers, but the human wave of fear was stronger. Wurmser's great army ceased to exist as a single fighting unit. Wurmser himself barely escaped capture, miraculously breaking out of the encirclement with his staff. He rode away, cursing the day he decided to get involved with that mad Corsican. His plans lay in ruins, his reputation was destroyed, and his army was crushed. It was a complete and unconditional collapse of the old strategy. The flank attack did not simply decide the outcome of the tactical battle, it broke the enemy's morale. The Austrians realized that they had been outplayed not by numbers, but by skill. Fear of encirclement paralyzed their will, forcing them to abandon even advantageous positions. It was a triumph of intellect over routine. Fiorella's soldiers, tired after the march but intoxicated with success, continued to chase the enemy. They captured hundreds of prisoners, banners, and cannons that the Austrians did not have time to take away. The battlefield was littered with trophies, testifying to the scale of the disaster. There are few examples in the history of warfare of such a perfectly coordinated strike by disparate forces. Napoleon managed to bring space and time together at a single point, creating a situation of absolute superiority. The hammer blow smashed the Austrian stone to dust. This man was the complete opposite of the intellectual Bonaparte, a former mercenary, street fighter, roughneck, and brawler. But on that day, his indomitable energy and personal bravery became the battering ram that broke through the Austrian center. Augereau personally led his soldiers into the attack, standing in the front ranks under a hail of bullets. His division was tasked with capturing a key hill and the town of Castiglione itself, which the Austrians were clinging to. The battle here was fought for every house, every street, turning into a fierce hand-to-hand combat. Augereau, brandishing his saber and shouting curses, inspired his men to press forward despite their losses. He was the embodiment of the fury of the French Revolution, sweeping away everything in its path. The Austrians, realizing that the loss of Castiglione meant a breach in their front line, fought with the desperation of the doomed. They turned buildings into fortresses, firing from windows and rooftops. But the French onslaught was so strong that no walls could stop them. Augereau captured the high ground, set up artillery there, and began firing at the retreating enemy columns. Augereau's contribution to the victory was so great that Napoleon later called him the hero of Castillon. It was his actions that prevented the Austrians from stabilizing the front and retreating in an organized manner. He did not give the enemy a second's respite, constantly attacking, pressing, and pursuing. His soldiers, inspired by their commander's example, performed miracles of bravery. At one point, it seemed that the attack had stalled, and the French faltered under heavy fire. Augereau grabbed the banner of one of the battalions and rushed forward himself, drawing the hesitant soldiers behind him. This action turned the tide of the local battle and returned the initiative to the French. Such moments of personal heroism cemented the army better than any discipline. The capture of Castillon was the point of no return for Wurmser's army. The united front line was broken, and control of the troops was finally lost. The Austrian regiments found themselves isolated from each other, unaware of what their neighbors were doing. The chaos became complete and all-encompassing. Augereau, covered in gunpowder smoke and dust, stood on the captured hill and watched the fleeing enemy. He did his job roughly but effectively, ensuring the success of Napoleon's complex plan. Without his straightforward pressure, the subtle maneuvers might not have worked. It was a perfect symbiosis of the commander-in-chief's cold calculation and the executor's fiery rage. The soldiers of Augereau's division, exhausted by battle, felt like they had defeated giants. They saw the backs of Europe's best soldiers and understood that now they would have to be reckoned with. The myth of the invincibility of the Austrian army was trampled under the boots of the French infantry. Success in the center allowed Napoleon to finally close the encirclement and finish off the scattered units. Castiglione became a symbol of French valor and tactical mastery. The name Ozerot was forever associated with this bloody but glorious day. The battle entered a stage of pursuit, where there was no longer any tactics, only a race for survival. The Austrian army, so formidable that morning, turned into a crowd of fugitives. Thousands of soldiers in white uniforms threw down their knapsacks, muskets, and banners to run faster to the Mincio River. The crossings were jammed with people, carts, and horses, creating monstrous traffic jams. The French cavalry, finally given room to maneuver, cut down the retreating soldiers and drove them into the water. Wurmser lost not only soldiers in this battle, but also his faith in the possibility of defeating Bonaparte using old methods. His army, divided and demoralized, retreated back to the Alps, from whence it had come with such pomp. Hopes for the blockade of Mantua collapsed, and the garrison of the fortress was once again completely isolated. Vienna's brilliant plan turned into a national disaster. The French captured a huge number of prisoners, about 20,000 people during the entire 5-day campaign. Hundreds of cannons and wagons full of supplies, which Napoleon's hungry army so desperately needed, became trophies. The soldiers were finally able to eat their fill and change into high-quality Austrian boots and uniforms. It was ironic that the army of the Republic was clothed by the army of the Empire. The victory at Castiglione was a turning point in the entire Italian campaign. It proved that Napoleon was capable of crushing superior enemy forces not by chance, but systematically. The Austrians were pushed far north, losing the strategic initiative and control of the region. Lombardy remained in French hands. The French soldiers were exhausted beyond measure, falling asleep and sleeping right among the bodies of the dead. They had marched hundreds of kilometers and fought for several days in a row with almost no sleep or rest. But it was the exhaustion of victors, sweet and heavy, mixed with pride. They had accomplished the impossible, rewriting history with their feet and bayonets. In his report to the Directory in Paris, Napoleon dryly listed the enemy's losses and captured trophies. But between the lines, the triumph of a new military doctrine could be read. He showed Europe that the old order was collapsing not only in politics, but also on the battlefield. The world saw the birth of a new military star of the first magnitude. The defeat of Wurmser meant that the siege of Mantua would be resumed. The French returned to the walls of the fortress, but now as masters of the situation. The garrison, seeing the defeat of their rescue expedition, lost heart. Their surrender was only a matter of time. This victory also had enormous political resonance. The Italian states realized that Austria could no longer protect them and began to seek friendship with Bonaparte. The young general's authority soared to the heavens, eclipsing all other commanders of the Republic. Castiglione became the grave of the Austrian general's reputation. They could not understand how this upstart had managed to defeat their perfect army. They blamed the weather, chance, betrayal, but did not want to admit that their time was up. The Mincio River carried away the bodies of the dead and the debris of imperial grandeur. The war in Italy continued, but its outcome was effectively decided during those hot August days. The Battle of Castiglione was not just another victory in a long list of battles, but the birth of modern strategy. It was a signal to Europe that the usual methods of warfare no longer worked, and that a man who thought completely differently had appeared on the battlefield. Napoleon showed that the main resource in war was not the number of soldiers or the thickness of fortress walls, but time and speed, which he managed with almost mathematical precision. He proved that decisiveness and the ability to make decisions faster than the enemy could change the course of an entire campaign. His command style was characterized by constant movement, thanks to which the enemy often did not even have time to understand what was happening. He introduced the concept of maneuver warfare, where the army is always changing positions and looking for the enemy's weak spots. In this new model of warfare, Napoleon's soldiers moved so quickly that they often exceeded even the most daring expectations of their commanders. The army could make long marches in a matter of days, which shattered the preconceptions of the time. Such actions gave the French an advantage because their opponents were accustomed to slow and difficult campaigns. Napoleon, on the other hand, struck where the enemy was weakest and least expected. He forced his opponents to constantly guess where the danger would come from. Thanks to this, maneuverability became his main weapon. The principle of divide and rule, applied at the tactical level, became the basis of military science for the next 2 centuries. Napoleon did not simply divide the enemy's forces. He did so in such a way that each enemy unit found itself in the worst possible conditions. He proved that smaller forces can defeat larger ones if they are first forced to spread out or separated from each other. Such tactics seemed risky, but he was able to calculate the routes and approach times of his own divisions so accurately that he often won before the enemy had time to unite. This idea was developed in European armies and became a subject of study in military schools. Thanks to this, Napoleon turned war into a dynamic art, where flexibility, not numbers, was the deciding factor. He transformed warfare from a static confrontation of lines into a dynamic dance of death, where every mistake cost an entire army. French troops no longer simply waited in fortifications or formed long lines, as previous armies had done. Now they moved continuously, bypassing, pressing, and striking the enemy where he was least prepared for the blow. Napoleon's soldiers won battles with their feet before the first shot was fired, because it was movement that created the advantage. This tactic gave the impression that the French army always appeared out of nowhere. The enemy constantly felt caught off guard. Castiglione also demonstrated the importance of unity of command, without which this system could not work. Napoleon created a structure where each commander understood the overall idea, rather than simply following orders. While Austrian generals coordinated their actions through a complex bureaucratic machine, the French army acted quickly thanks to its unified command. Napoleon's will permeated the entire army instantly, making it resemble a single organism. He was the brain, and the divisions were his limbs, acting in sync and with precision. This connection allowed him to completely change the course of an operation at critical moments. It was a new type of machine, controlled by a single operator who saw things on the map that others did not notice. Napoleon could instantly correlate the position of his troops with the movements of the enemy, and make decisions that, in practice, proved to be the only correct ones. His ability to keep several directions in mind at once allowed him to switch quickly between tasks. This model of command became a model for future armies that sought to transmit orders quickly. Subsequently, many European states began to replicate this system. It became the foundation for what would later be called operational art. The lesson of the abandoned siege weapons became a textbook example of strategic flexibility, which was rarely demonstrated by 18th century commanders. Napoleon abandoned the long siege, realizing that time was working against him. He showed the ability to sacrifice valuable property for the sake of the main goal, and this determination surprised even his closest associates. The ability to make such decisions distinguished genius from craftsmanship, as many commanders considered the loss of cannons a sign of weakness. Napoleon, however, understood that defeating the enemy's main army was more important than preserving property. For him, the means always served the end. Napoleon taught the world not to cling to the past in the form of old methods of warfare. He showed that it is better to abandon the slow and familiar path if it prevents you from achieving your main goal. At Castiglione, he made a choice that seemed crazy at first glance, but soon proved to be brilliantly correct. He looked boldly to the future, seeing more strength in maneuvering than in fortress walls. This way of thinking became the basis for his future victories. Thanks to Castiglione, he demonstrated for the first time how to rebuild an army for new realities. After Castiglione, Europe realized with horror and admiration that the rules of the game had changed forever. Monarchies understood that their usual slowness in decision-making led to defeat. The old unwieldy armies were defenseless against the onslaught of new revolutionary tactics that broke the usual order. The French were able to show that speed could replace numbers. Bonaparte became a symbol of this change and the embodiment of an army that was no longer afraid to take risks. His name became known even in places where French generals had never been heard of before. European observers studied the actions of the young commander with concern, trying to understand how he managed to achieve such victories. Austrian and Prussian officers wrote reports in which they acknowledged that they were facing a new style of warfare. They noted that the French army moved quickly, and its generals acted with less dependence on headquarters. This independence and speed became the subject of imitation in dozens of armies. After Castiglione, it became clear that those who did not change would lose in future wars. Napoleon unwittingly forced everyone to speed up. Studying this battle today, we see the seeds of the blitzkrieg and deep operations of the 20th century. The principles of rapid encirclement and deep penetration into enemy rear areas were laid down here. Ideas that seemed bold in Italy in 1796 became the basis of military theory a century later.